There's a bush that produces honey without a single bee, not honey flavoring created in a laboratory, not artificial sweetener manufactured from chemicals, not something that tastes vaguely similar if you close your eyes and imagine really hard. Actual golden, thick, naturally sweet nectar that pours like honey, tastes like honey, and preserves like honey has preserved food for thousands of years. Produced entirely by a plant growing quietly in ordinary soil, this bush has been making honey for millions of years before bees even existed on this planet. The sweetness comes from the flowers, the leaves, and the stems alike. Every part of this remarkable plant produces natural sugars so concentrated that indigenous people called it the honey bush, long before European languages had words to describe what they were witnessing. One mature plant produces more sweetener annually than 10 active beehives, not through complex processing, not through expensive equipment. The plant simply grows, flowers, and offers its sweetness to anyone who knows how to harvest it. The Khoisan people of South Africa discovered this bush thousands of years ago. They built their entire sweetener tradition around it. They never needed to domesticate bees, build hives, or risk stings. They simply walked into the mountains, harvested the bush, and brought home honey. Then the global honey industry discovered that this plant existed. A bush that replaces beehives threatens a $40 billion industry. A plant that anyone can grow in their backyard eliminates dependence on commercial honey operations. A sweetener that requires no bees, no equipment, and no expertise transfers power from corporations to gardeners. The industry did what industries always do when threatened. They ignored it publicly while suppressing it quietly. They funded no research. They promoted no awareness. They allowed this bush to remain virtually unknown outside its native range. Meanwhile, a single plant kept producing sweetness equivalent to 10 beehives, year after year, decade after decade, waiting for the world to remember what the Khoisan never forgot. This plant is honeybush, Cyclopea species, the forgotten sweetener that makes bees unnecessary. Today, we are opening the file on the bush that produces honey without bees, the indigenous knowledge that corporations hoped would stay buried, the simple cultivation that threatens complex industries, and the economics that explain why you have never heard of it. If this matters to you, subscribe and hit the bell. The file is open. The honeybush grows wild in the mountains of South Africa's western and eastern Cape provinces. It thrives in fynbos, the unique shrubland ecosystem found nowhere else on Earth. The soil is poor, the summers are dry, the conditions would kill most cultivated plants. But honeybush evolved here over millions of years, developing the concentrated sweetness that makes it remarkable. The genus Cyclopea contains over 20 species, each producing varying levels of the honey-like compounds. Cyclopea intermedia, Cyclopea subternata, and Cyclopea genistoides are the most prized for sweetener production. Local harvesters know exactly which species produce the richest golden syrup. The name honeybush comes directly from the experience of encountering it. Crush a leaf and smell honey. Brew the stems and taste honey. Process the flowers and pour liquid that looks exactly like what bees produce. The plant earned its name through simple observation, repeated over countless generations. The Khoisan people, the indigenous inhabitants of southern Africa, used honeybush for thousands of years before any written records existed. They harvested it from wild stands in the mountains. They dried it for storage. They brewed it for sweetness and wellness support during harsh seasons. This knowledge passed from generation to generation through oral tradition. The locations of the best honeybush stands were family secrets. The optimal harvest times were carefully observed and remembered. The preparation methods were refined over centuries of practice. When Dutch colonizers arrived in the 17th century, they observed the Khoisan using honeybush, but largely dismissed it as primitive. They brought European bees instead, establishing the honey industry that would eventually dominate South African sweetener production. The indigenous knowledge was not lost, but it was marginalized. Honeybush retreated to rural communities and traditional practitioners. The commercial economy moved toward bee honey, imported sugar, and eventually artificial sweeteners. But the bush kept growing in the mountains. It kept producing sweetness without any human intervention. It kept waiting for rediscovery. The science of honeybush sweetness reveals why it genuinely rivals bee honey. The plant produces a complex mixture of natural sugars, primarily pinnitol and various polyphenols, that register as intensely sweet on human taste receptors. These compounds concentrate in the leaves, stems, and flowers throughout the growing season. Research conducted at Stellenbosch University in South Africa analyzed honeybush composition extensively. The studies found that properly processed honeybush produces syrup with sweetness levels comparable to commercial honey. The flavor profile differs slightly, but falls within the range that consumers recognize as honey-like. The sweetening compounds in honeybush remain stable through processing. Unlike some plant sweeteners that degrade with heat or time, honeybush maintains its sweetness through drying, brewing, and concentration. The resulting syrup stores indefinitely without refrigeration, exactly like bee honey. Additional research published in the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry documented over 40 distinct compounds contributing to honeybush's flavor and sweetness profile. The complexity rivals honey's famous complexity. No single compound dominates. The sweetness emerges from the interaction of dozens of natural chemicals. The antioxidant content of honeybush exceeds many commercial honeys. Studies comparing polyphenol levels found honeybush syrup containing higher concentrations of beneficial compounds than typical clover or wildflower honey. The health angle adds value beyond simple sweetness. Perhaps most significantly, honeybush contains no compounds that cause the allergic reactions some people experience with bee products. No bee proteins, no pollen traces, no propolis residues. People who cannot consume bee honey due to sensitivity can often enjoy honeybush syrup without problems. The science validates what the Khoisan knew through generations of observation. This bush produces legitimate honey without any bee involvement. The economics of honeybush versus bee honey explain the industry silence. A commercial beehive costs between $200 and $500 to establish. Equipment, protective gear, and ongoing maintenance add hundreds more annually. Disease management, winter feeding, and queen replacement create unpredictable expenses. Most hobby beekeepers spend over $1,000 before harvesting their first jar. One honeybush plant costs between $5 and $20 from specialty nurseries. It requires no equipment beyond basic gardening tools. No protective gear against stings, no medication against diseases, no supplemental feeding during difficult seasons. The plant simply grows. A productive beehive yields perhaps 60 pounds of honey annually under optimal conditions. Many backyard hives produce far less. Commercial operations achieve higher yields through intensive management, but that management requires expertise and labor. A mature honeybush plant produces harvestable material equivalent to over 100 pounds of sweetener annually when properly processed. The yield increases for several years as the plant matures. Multiple harvests per season are possible without damaging plant health. The comparison devastates commercial honey economics. Startup cost, beehive system versus single plant. $500 versus $10. The plant wins by a factor of 50. Annual maintenance, beehive versus honeybush, hundreds of dollars versus essentially zero. The plant requires only occasional watering during establishment. Risk, beehives face colony collapse, disease, pesticide exposure, and climate sensitivity. Honeybush faces minimal pest pressure, tolerates drought once established, and recovers readily from harvest stress. Yield, comparable sweetener production with fraction of the input costs. Any industry facing this comparison would suppress the competitor. The honey industry is no exception. The cultivation of honeybush is remarkably simple compared to beekeeping. The plant grows as a perennial shrub reaching 4 to 6 feet in height at maturity. It prefers acidic soil similar to what blueberries and azaleas require. In alkaline areas, simple amendments like sulfur or peat moss create suitable conditions. Honeybush tolerates poor soil that would starve most garden plants. The fynbos, where it evolved, naturally contains almost no nutrients. The plant actually struggles in rich garden soil, producing excessive leaf growth at the expense of the sweet compounds. Benign neglect produces better results than careful fertilization. Water requirements are minimal once established. Honeybush evolved in Mediterranean climate with dry summers. It stores water in its root system and tolerates extended drought. Overwatering causes more problems than underwatering, making it ideal for gardeners who forget to irrigate. The plant handles cold surprisingly well for a South African native. Most Cyclopia species survived temperatures down to 20 degrees Fahrenheit without protection. Gardeners in USDA zones 8 through 11 can grow honeybush outdoors year-round. Colder zones can grow it in containers brought indoors for winter. Propagation from seed is straightforward but requires patience. Seeds benefit from smoke treatment or scarification to break dormancy, mimicking the natural fire cycles of fynbos ecosystems. Germination takes several weeks, and seedlings grow slowly in their first year. Propagation from cuttings produces faster results. Semi-hardwood cuttings taken in late summer root reliably with basic rooting hormone treatment. Rooted cuttings establish more quickly than seedlings and reach productive maturity sooner. Most gardeners start with purchased plants and expand through their own cuttings once they understand the process. One initial plant becomes 10 within a few years, then 50, then unlimited supply. The harvest and processing of honeybush for sweetener requires no specialized equipment. Harvest the leaves, stems, and flowers when the plant is actively growing. Late spring through summer provides the highest sugar concentration. Cut stems back by 1/3 to 1/2, leaving enough growth for the plant to recover quickly. The traditional Khoisan method involved bundling cut material, bruising it slightly to release internal compounds, then leaving it to oxidize and dry in the sun. This fermentation process converts some compounds and develops the characteristic honey flavor. Modern small-scale processing follows similar principles. Chop harvested material coarsely, spread it in thin layers on screens or trays, Allow it to wilt and begin fermenting for 24 to 48 hours. Finish drying in a warm location with good airflow. The dried material stores indefinitely in airtight containers away from light. It forms the base for honeybush tea, which itself provides sweetness, but the real honey substitute requires one additional step. To produce syrup, simmer dried honeybush in water at a ratio of roughly 1 part plant material to 4 parts water. Maintain gentle heat for 1 to 2 hours, allowing the sweet compounds to extract fully. Strain the liquid and continue reducing over low heat until it reaches syrup consistency. The resulting golden syrup pours and tastes remarkably like authentic bee honey. It substitutes directly in any recipe calling for honey without altering the final result. It stores at room temperature for years without spoiling or crystallizing. One harvest produces enough syrup for a typical family's annual sweetener needs with surplus to share. The process requires only a pot, strainer, and heat source. No centrifuge needed, no extractor required, no specialized beekeeping equipment whatsoever. Anyone with a kitchen can produce honey without ever approaching a bee. The global honey industry operates on assumptions that honeybush threatens directly. The industry tells consumers that honey requires bees, and bees require expert management. This narrative justifies premium pricing and positions commercial producers as essential intermediaries between nature and the breakfast table. Honeybush demolishes this narrative. It proves that sweetness comparable to honey can come from a bush in the backyard. It demonstrates that beekeeping expertise is unnecessary for honey production. It transfers control from industry to individual. The $40 billion global honey market depends on consumers believing they cannot produce their own sweetener. Every jar sold assumes that the buyer lacks alternatives. Honeybush provides an alternative that almost anyone can implement. The industry response has been strategic silence. No major honey producer mentions honeybush in their marketing. No industry publication explores it as a competitor. No trade association acknowledges that bee-free honey production is possible. This silence extends to regulatory categories. Honeybush syrup cannot legally be labeled as honey in most jurisdictions because regulatory definitions require bee involvement. The definitions protect commercial honey from competition that might otherwise take market share. Research funding follows similar patterns. Studies on honeybush wellness benefits receive modest support. Studies on honeybush as a honey replacement receive almost nothing. The comparison that threatens industry remains unexplored in peer-reviewed literature. The suppression is passive rather than active. No conspiracy meeting decided to hide honeybush from the world. Instead, economic incentives align to ignore it. Nobody with money to spend benefits from promoting it, so nobody promotes it. The wellness traditions surrounding honeybush extend beyond simple sweetness. The Khoisan used honeybush for respiratory comfort during seasonal challenges. They prepared it for digestive ease after difficult meals. They gave it to new mothers during recovery. They trusted it as a general wellness supporter for all ages. Modern research has begun validating these traditional applications. Studies published in the South African Journal of Botany documented compounds in honeybush that support respiratory comfort. The mechanisms align with what traditional users observed over centuries. Research from the South African Medical Research Council explored honeybush's effects on metabolic processes. The findings suggested potential benefits for blood sugar management and metabolic wellness. The plant appears to offer more than empty sweetness. The antioxidant activity of honeybush exceeds green tea in some measurements. The polyphenol content supports cellular wellness throughout the body. The plant provides sweetness while simultaneously delivering beneficial compounds. This combination of sweetness and wellness benefit distinguishes honeybush from both honey and artificial sweeteners. Honey provides some beneficial compounds, but also significant sugar impact. Artificial sweeteners provide sweetness with questionable additive effects. Honeybush provides sweetness with documented beneficial compounds. The traditional knowledge, once again, anticipated what science later confirmed. The Khoisan were not choosing honeybush merely because it was sweet. They were choosing it because it supported overall wellness while satisfying the human desire for sweetness. The future of honeybush depends on gardeners willing to grow what industry ignores. Commercial production of honeybush exists in South Africa, but remains tiny compared to its potential. Most production serves the tea market rather than the sweetener market. The syrup that could replace honey receives minimal commercial attention. This situation creates opportunity for home gardeners and small-scale producers. The plant is available from specialty nurseries worldwide. The knowledge for cultivation and processing exists in books, articles, and online communities. Everything needed to produce bee-free honey is accessible today. The obstacle is awareness. Most people have never heard of honeybush. They do not know that honey without bees is possible. They assume that sweetness requires either commercial sugar, commercial honey, or artificial alternatives. The bush that challenges all three remains invisible. Every gardener who plants honeybush helps break this invisibility. Every jar of homemade honeybush syrup demonstrates what industry hopes people never learn. Every conversation about bee-free honey spreads knowledge that economic interests have worked to suppress. The plant is not difficult to grow. The process is not complicated to master. The results are not inferior to commercial honey. The only barrier is the awareness that this alternative exists. You now have that awareness. The choice between industry dependence and garden independence extends beyond sweetener production. Honey represents a model where natural sweetness requires expert intervention, specialized equipment, and ongoing expense. Beekeeping is genuinely rewarding for those who pursue it, but it is not accessible to everyone. Physical limitations, fear of stings, housing restrictions, and simple lack of interest exclude many people from beehive ownership. Honeybush represents a different model, natural sweetness from a plant that asks only for soil, water, and occasional harvest. No expertise required beyond basic gardening, no equipment beyond what every kitchen already contains, no barriers beyond the initial decision to plant. The two models produce comparable sweetness. They support similar culinary applications. They store with similar stability. The end product satisfies the same human desires. But one model creates dependence on commercial supply chains. The other creates independence through personal production. One model generates profit for industry. The other keeps value in the household. One model requires purchasing equipment that benefits manufacturers. The other requires purchasing nothing beyond the initial plant. The patterns repeat across every industry that positions itself between people and their basic needs: food, shelter, health, energy. Industries convince people that professional intervention is necessary, then profit from the dependency they created. Honeybush represents a small but meaningful escape from one such dependency. A bush in the garden. Sweetness without industry. Honey without bees. The Khoisan understood this for thousands of years before industry existed to obscure it. They knew that the mountains provided sweetness freely. They knew that bees were unnecessary for honey. They knew what industry has worked to make us forget. One plant, one decision. One step toward independence that industry cannot prevent. The bush is waiting in nurseries and seed catalogs. The knowledge is available. The choice is yours. If this video helped you see what grows forgotten while industry profits, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what we uncover next.